We'll make a new tomorrow. Talk to me. What makes this happy face? Showing off. Don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face?
All right. Hello, everyone. There we are. Where are my captions? Oh, got to tell it to start. Then they start. Okay, there we are. Crisis averted. All right, so we are up to chapter 5 in the problem of slavery in Western culture. So far, it has been a great read. So if you haven't seen it, a couple of the chapters are still on Twitch. Otherwise, the earliest ones are now on the YouTube channel. So you can go back there, and they'll all get transferred to there as I go. So if you want to binge on them or watch them, at your leisure, they'll always be there. Anyway, let's go. Chapter 5. Oh, I need my cheaters. I can see that, but it's a bit more of a strain than is necessary. All right. Changing views on the value and dangers of American slavery. In 1688, Governor Denonville of Canada wrote to Louis XIV and begged him to end the manpower shortage of New France by authorizing direct shipments of Negro slaves. The Canadian case for slavery was presented more fully to the king by Rouet de Autier. I know I butchered that, sorry. The Attorney General, who argued that the northern colony could never hope to prosper until enterprises were assured a reliable supply of slave labor. De Autier, Autiot, I'm not sure, did his best to prove that Negroes could thrive in the frigid wilds. Their presence in New England and New Holland showed they could endure harsh winters. In Canada, no doubt, they would have to be warmly clad, but this apparent expense simply opened the way to greater profits. Indians, he pointed out, seasoned beaver skins by wearing them until they were saturated in sweat and oil, which made the long hair fall off and thereby doubled the price. A Canadian slave owner could thus keep his Negroes warm in winter and at the same time double the price of his beaver skins. Could any West Indian planter claim so much? The king was apparently persuaded that Canadians needed slaves for agriculture and clearing new ground, and although he continued to fear large financial losses if the Negroes should die from the cold climate, he gave his consent to Governor Deneville's proposal. But despite the renewal of such authorization in 1701 and the legal establishment of slavery in 1709, Canada was spectacularly unsuccessful in her effort to become a second Brazil. This was largely because she could not compete with the richer colonies of the South for a supply of labor that was never able to meet the demand. Nevertheless, Canadian officials were reluctant to give up their vision of converting New France into a thriving slave colony. In 1716, the intendant attributed the success of New York and New England to Negro labor and predicted that Canada could produce wheat and other commodities for the West Indian markets if she were given sufficient credit to buy slaves. The continuing pleas to France pictured Negro slavery as the cure for all of Canada's economic and social ills. Canada Canadian officials greatly exaggerated New England's dependence on slave labor, but the general assumptions of Governor Denonville and Rouet de Auteuil, uh, were not totally foreign to the New England mind. 43 years before Denonville's appeal to Louis XIV, Emmanuel Downing had expressed an ardent hope to his brother-in-law John Winthrop that Indians captured in just wars, quote unquote just wars, might be exchanged in the West Indies for Negro slaves. For, quote, for I do not see how we can thrive until we get into a stock of slaves sufficient to do all our business, for our children's children will hardly see this great continent filled with people, so that our servants will still desire freedom to plant for themselves and not stay but for very great wages. End quote. For at least some New Englanders, as for their northern neighbors, the West Indies presented a model for solving the problem of a chronic shortage of labor. Since it has often been assumed that slavery was morally repugnant to most Americans, and that its tragic introduction was the response of commercial avarice to a tropical climate, such views raise disturbing questions. For the quote unquote peculiar institution truly and was the peculiar institution truly an aberration whose baneful effects were confined to certain regions, or was it accepted by all colonizing states alike as a vital and necessary part of American expansion? Was slavery morally and economically uncongenial to the northern colonies, or was it simply that the West Indies and southern colonies were better equipped to buy cheap labor with needed commodities, and hence became the engines that developed America's economic power? Is it possible that the slave system provided the initial thrust to an economy that could later rely on immigration, technology, and expanding domestic markets? Although we have already touched on such questions in Chapter 1, thus far we have been primarily concerned with slavery as a moral problem in the culture and thought of Western Europe. We now need to turn to the assumptions, attitudes, and circumstances which governed the development of the institution in the New World. We shall not attempt to present a full account of the early history of American slavery. We should, however, look at certain forces that favored the expansion of Negro bondage in America, as well as at conflicts of interest and changing historical conditions that could produce a climate hospitable to anti-slavery thought. Here briefly are the points to be elaborated in this chapter. Although northern colonists sometimes looked enviously at the West Indians' armies of labor and fabled wealth, the American demand for slaves was not a constant or universal force. In most colonies, the institution developed slowly and as a result of the uncoordinated decisions and preferences of many people. If a demand for cheap labor was nearly universal throughout the Americas, the motives of planters, merchants, and legislators were complicated by problems of credit and payments, by a need for revenue, by the mercantilist policies of mother countries, by a desire for immigration from Europe, and by a widespread fear of servile insurrection. It was possible for the same colonists to call in one breath for more slaves at cheaper prices, and in the next to deplore the growing disproportion between the Negro and white races. For some 2.5 centuries, the policies of most New World colonies were dominated by two seemingly contradictory views of Negro slavery. According to the first, the institution was the base on which the entire economy rested, and was the main route to individual wealth and imperial grandeur. It was therefore essential that the government ensure a continuing supply of Africans and protect slaveholders in the free enjoyment of their property. According to the second, Negro slaves endangered public security, and it was therefore the duty of the government to limit their numbers, control their activities, and encourage the introduction of white servants and artisans. While these divergent views might coexist in the same colony, the emphasis given to one or the other depended on a variety of circumstances. With a very few exceptions, however, it was not until the second half of the 18th century that public policy was influenced by a belief that slavery was incompatible with basic ideals or institutions. A conflict between the colonist's desire for labor and his fear of the Negro slave was apparent from the very beginning. The Negroes whom Governor Ovando had been authorized to transport to Hispaniola in 1502 were born in Iberia and were thus presumably Christian. Yet Ovando soon became alarmed at the danger of Negroes inciting Indians to revolt, and he asked that the slave trade, then in its infancy, be suspended. In 1514, after King Ferdinand had revived the traffic, the royal treasurer said that the number of Negroes should be kept to a minimum in the interest of security. But despite an original order that the proportion of Negroes to Spaniards be limited to 1 to 3, it was estimated by 1560 that the Negroes in Hispaniola outnumbered the Europeans 15 to 1. According to Fernando Romero, the Negro slave made it possible for the Spanish to colonize America, for by nature the conquistadors were slow to learn the necessity of working themselves, and the Indians' mortality was too great to ensure an adequate supply of labor. It has often been forgotten that there were fewer whites than Negro slaves in colonial Lima and Mexico City. In Mexico, imported Negroes outnumbered white immigrants for more than a century and helped provide the labor which made the colony one of the richest countries in the world. But while the Negroes toiled in the mines and on the latifundia that supported the mines, they also broke into open revolt as early as 1537. In 1554, Louis de Velasco warned the king that the country might face disaster if the number of licenses to import slaves were not curtailed. The slave trade, however, was becoming a prodigious enterprise which could not easily be regulated or shut off at will. The Portuguese, as leaders of what they took to be a new crusade, built numerous establishments on the African coast for the combined purposes of spreading their faith and reaping commercial benefit. Among their most important customers were the merchants and speculators of Europe who had acquired the privilege of supplying the Spanish Empire with slaves. After 1518, when Charles V rewarded one of his favorites with a license to furnish the colonies with 4,000 Negroes, this supposedly exclusive right was divided and sold, and was then followed by additional licenses and contracts, which soon became a vital source of revenue for the Spanish throne. In the New World, Cartagena emerged as a booming slave entrepot, which distributed Negroes to the eager proprietors of mines and sugar fields. Negro slavery had seemed to develop almost fortuitously in Latin America, but after a century of colonial history, it had become a basic system of labor from Peru to Puerto Rico. In Brazil, priests as well as planters acknowledged that without African labor, Portuguese America would be an impossibility. It was this realization which became increasingly prevalent in Latin America that made the slave trade and then slavery itself so important for the commercial expansion of Western Europe. The nearly unlimited demand for slaves in the Spanish Empire might provide the opening wedge for an even more profitable commerce, and in the eyes of European expansionists who looked with awe at the mountains of Spanish bullion and tropical produce, Latin America exemplified the values of overseas colonies. During the 16th century, France and Britain had little opportunity to exploit the connection between slavery and American expansion, since they lacked colonies of their own and were jealously excluded from Spanish ports. To be sure, John Hawkins dazzled the world by forcibly crashing the Spanish markets and selling slaves at enormous profit. But the utter failure of Hawkins' third slaving voyage proved that such rich profits could be secured only by acquiring bases on the African coast and in the Caribbean. As early as the 1590s, the Dutch had begun to undermine Portuguese power on the Guinea coast, and by 1637, when they won dominance by capturing the strategic fortress of Elmina, they had also established a considerable beachhead in Brazil and had seized Curaçao and St. Eustatius, from which slaves could conveniently be smuggled into the Spanish colonies. Their timing proved to be most fortunate, for in 1640 Portugal rose in arms against 60 years of Spanish domination, and for the next 22 years Spain altogether suspended the asiento or slave contract, which had been in Portuguese hands since the beginning of the century. In 1662, when Spain finally moved once again to meet her colonists' demand for slaves, her choices were limited by the changing balance of power. France had already won supremacy over Spain on the continent, and it was the determined policy of Colbert, who took office in 1662, to encourage the slave trade as part of the vast mercantilist system. England had already deprived Spain of Jamaica and had emerged from a period of civil war and political upheaval with a fresh appetite for commercial power. In 1663, the Duke of York and a group of prominent shareholders, including the king himself, would launch the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading to Africa, which 9 years later would be reorganized as the powerful Royal African Company. Before the end of the 17th century, the African coast was dotted with slave trading posts, which flew the flags of Portugal, France, England, Holland, Denmark, and Brandenburg. While the Germans would eventually sell out to the Dutch, even the Danes acquired an entrepot at St. Thomas, from which they profitably smuggled slaves to the Spanish. Thus, no matter who received the asiento, a large proportion of the slaves purchased by Spanish colonists would come from illegal sources. In 1662, Spain granted the asiento to Genoese merchants, who in turn bargained with the English Company of Royal Adventurers and with the Dutch West India Company. After considerable vacillation and soul-searching, the Spanish finally turned directly to the Dutch and eventually to the French. Largely in the hope of monopolizing a hitherto irregular and competitive trade, the British began negotiations early in the 18th century, which culminated in the well-known article of the Treaty of Utrecht. But though the award of the asiento to the South Sea Company was celebrated in London by a torchlight procession, there was soon conflict between that ill-fated company and its supplier, the Royal African Company. And Jamaicans who had done well by smuggling when the Asiento had been held by France, now resented the loss of prime slaves to foreign competitors and tried unsuccessfully to impose a duty on the re-export of the South Sea Company's Negroes, who were shipped initially to their island. By the 1730s, England was ready to admit that the Asiento was a losing business. It had been the markets and produce of the Spanish colonies that had originally lured the maritime powers into the slave trade, but the profits anticipated from monopolizing the Spanish trade proved to be illusory. Eventually, Spanish policy was forced to move toward the principle of a free commerce in slaves, but meanwhile British planters might well question the wisdom of stocking Cuba with 10,700 Negroes during a brief 9 months of military occupation. Conflicts of interest might provide the ground for general dissatisfaction with a trade that augmented the labor force of rival colonies. By the mid-17th century, the tropical colonies of Britain and France had begun to produce sugar, which required for its cultivation a substantial amount of labor. A shortage of labor was the complaint of every colony from Canada to Barbados, but especially of areas rich in fertile land and dependent on the exportation of tobacco, rice, or sugar. For the small planter who lacked capital and who could not plan far into the future, the need for labor was well met by indentured servants. It had been estimated that such unfree workers formed more than half of all white immigration to the continental colonies south of New England. Yet, even when supplemented by convicts and political prisoners, the number was never equal to the demand. It was moreover the considered opinion of the governor of Barbados that 3 Negroes could do more work at cheaper cost than one white servant. But regardless of the possible economic merits of slave labor, free planters, even in the Caribbean, possessed sufficient capital to contract in advance for the minimum quantities of Negroes initially offered by the monopolistic companies. Hence, in 1663, Governor Charles Calvert confessed to Lord Baltimore that Maryland, though eager to receive Negroes, was not rich enough to guarantee a profitable annual market to the company of royal adventurers. Cheaper slaves meant reduced costs of production, and colonial legislators were alert to the fact that a predictable influx of slaves would be a predictable source of revenue. Britain was determined, however, to control the slave trade for her own advantage, and for this purpose her rulers favored a monopolistic company powerful enough to amass capital and specialized knowledge, maintain forts and installations on the African coast, and eclipse the efforts of rival nations. Such ambitious designs were not easy to execute. Despite impressive profits from the slave trade, the British companies suffered losses in the wars with Holland. Their monopoly was infringed upon by interlopers, including a few New Englanders, and they were plagued by problems of credit, payments, and organization. It was, after all, no small matter to undertake the competitive marketing of quantities of goods in a totally alien Africa, or to supply large numbers of laborers to distant purchasers whose optimism usually transcended their ability to pay, and though the royal adventurers enjoyed the direct support of the royal family and of men deeply involved in colonial expansion, such as Lord Berkeley and Sir George Carteret, the colonists themselves remained unsatisfied. In 1662, Barbados petitioned the king to allow free trade in slaves. Governor Willoughby later predicted that the island's economy would be ruined if the monopoly were continued. The Jamaican Council and Assembly pleaded with the Duke of York to induce the Royal African Company to furnish a cheaper and more plentiful supply of slaves, and the Leeward Islands, chafing under the necessity of buying their slaves from Nevis, which was the official depot of the Royal African Company, were further outraged in 1682 when the company shut off their supply altogether as retaliation against local laws which made it difficult to recover debts incurred from the purchase of Negroes. King Charles, however, publicly defended the privileges of the company and warned his American subjects not to incur his wrath by trying to crash the gates of Africa on their own. In the 1680s, the colonial demands for a free slave trade were reinforced by the arguments of British merchants and investors who accused the company of complacent inefficiency. In defense, the company pointed to its heavy expenses in maintaining posts in Africa and charged that the interlopers, who were often encouraged by colonial officials, had injured the trade by kidnapping prominent Africans and arousing the revenge of their fellow tribesmen. But Parliament, convinced that the slave trade was, quote, highly beneficial and advantageous to their kingdom and to the plantations and colonies, end quote, gave way in 1698 and opened the traffic to private traders willing to pay a 10% duty, which went to the Royal African Company as compensation for the upkeep of forts. Almost immediately, the African coast swarmed with independent traders. For a time, the French Guinea Company tried to cooperate with the Royal African Company in maintaining prices and standards, but the pattern which the large companies had imposed on the African trade slowly disintegrated. In the 18th century, the only legislative forces in this violent and intensely competitive commerce would be the pressures of supply and demand. By the time of the American Revolution, it was morally reassuring to think of Negro slavery as a burden forced by a tyrannical government on an unwilling people. But Britain never required her colonists to buy slaves, and in truth, the original and essential grievance of the colonists who cared about the matter was that they could not buy enough slaves at a reasonable price. In every colony there was at least a small market for domestic servants, and in New England, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, slave labor was applied to farming and to a variety of trades and productive industries. Since the slave trade tended to deposit numbers of Negroes at the ports from which it was carried on, it is not surprising that the activities of the Pepperells, Saffins, Cabots, Faneuils, Belchers, and Browns left a scattering of slaves along the New England coast, from Kittery to Newport. By 1756, they constituted some 16% of the population of both Newport and New York City. The great landed proprietors of the fertile stock farming region of southern Rhode Island depended on slave labor, and while the proportion of Negroes remained very small in other parts of New England, the Yankees who moved to Westchester and Long Island were quick to purchase slaves. Ulrich B. Phillips has estimated that by 1750 slaves were owned by 1/10 of the households in the province of New York. That's interesting. No matter what their potential demand might have been, the northern colonies were not ordinarily in a position to compete for slaves with the West Indies, where increased numbers of laborers were required to extract sugar from the depleted soil of the Leeward Islands, to develop new plantations in Jamaica, and to fill the ranks that were constantly cut down by a ghastly rate of mortality. It is significant that the small slave trade to Pennsylvania hit its peak during the 7 Years' War, which disrupted markets in the West Indies. Even the planters of Virginia, who thought that slaves would enable them to compete on a better footing with the Spanish tobacco colonies, found it difficult to pay the price for substantial shipments of Negroes. Although the Assembly had earlier tried to encourage the importation of slaves, in 1670 the proportion in Virginia was less than that in Rhode Island a century later. It was only in the 1680s and the 1690s that the example of large planters such as William Byrd and William Fitzhugh pointed the way to reduce production costs and thus to fortune. But despite a vast increase in slaves during the early decades of the 18th century, the demand in Virginia was stabilized by a fear of debt in the face of overproduction and an uncertain tobacco market. And if the rice planters of Carolina were generally more confident of the future, Henry Laurens confessed in 1768 that selling slaves was a risky business since a ship could not move on to the most favorable market, as in the West Indies, and prices tended to be too high or too low to make a profit. After deciding to abandon a trade which he found distasteful, Laurens was again attracted by the prospect of a good market with the lifting of the pre-revolution non-importation agreement. In 1773, however, he feared that South Carolina was overstocked with Negroes, especially in light of her mounting debts and hard times. As a good patriot, he tended by 1776 to think of the slave trade as a British iniquity. We'll just see how we doing here. We got a ways to go. Early. Okay, we are on page 137, and we have to go to 164. Luckily, there are lots and lots of footnotes that we're skipping. We have noticed that even in the 16th century, the demand for slaves in the Spanish colonies was tempered by the fear that excessive numbers of Negroes would endanger security. This fear of servile revolt would be intrinsic to American slavery, no matter what later apologists for the institution might say of the Negro's docility. West Indian planters who clamored for more Negroes were well aware of the risks they took, especially during war, in stocking vulnerable islands with what amounted to captured foreign armies. In the last quarter of the 17th century, the legislators of Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands, South Carolina, wherever the proportion of slaves rose rapidly, made every effort to increase security by attracting white settlers or by requiring planters to maintain a prescribed number of white servants capable of bearing arms. But the laws requiring a fixed proportion of whites to Negroes were no more effective than had been the similar efforts of the Spanish. In Jamaica, the so-called deficiency laws, which allowed a planter to pay a tax in lieu of supporting white servants, simply became measures for increasing revenue. By 1773, a joint committee of the Jamaican Council and Assembly could point to the dangers faced by an island whose white population had risen in 80 years from 7,768 to only 16,000, while the slave population had shot from 9,504 to some 200,000. Nor were such fears imaginary. During the 18th century, there were more than a dozen slave revolts in Jamaica alone, and in many colonies escaping Negroes or Maroons carried on a sporadic and unnerving guerrilla warfare. Wait a minute. There were such fears. During the 18th century, there were more than a dozen slave revolts in Jamaica alone, and in many colonies, escaped Negroes or Maroons carried on a sporadic and unnerving guerrilla warfare. That sentence just didn't register the first time. In 1712, a slave insurrection and pitched battle brought hysteria to New York City and gave proof that such phenomena could not necessarily be confined to the Caribbean. In the 1730s and 1740s, the British colonies were rocked by successive waves of panic. A Spanish royal decree of 1733 confirmed earlier rulings that slaves of Protestant colonies would be considered free if they escaped to Spanish territory. Since a small boat could reach Cuba from Jamaica, and since northern Florida was a short distance from South Carolina, this policy provoked considerable anxiety. Soon afterward, Jamaica exploded with several bloody insurrections. Similar uprisings occurred in other islands, which were suffering from a fall in sugar prices and hence from reduced rations of food. In 1739, a large group of South Carolina slaves seized arms and began marching southward, killing people and burning houses on the way. A detected conspiracy of Negroes in Charlestown in 1740 was followed the next year by mass hysteria in New York City, where, as punishment for an alleged plot, 18 slaves were hanged and 13 burned alive. In England, the news of such repeated violence focused attention on the dangers of American slavery. Throughout the colonies, it accentuated a desire for a higher ratio of whites to Negroes, and also reinforced an inclination to blame outsiders for the multiplying problems of Negro bondage. Colonel William Byrd, whose father had been part owner of a slave ship, and whose family wealth had grown from dealing in slaves as well as from slave labor, wrote in 1736 that where I got that, I don't know, that Virginia was in danger of becoming a New Guinea and of being convulsed by servile war. Confident that in Virginia the necessary severities of bondage were less extreme than in the West Indies, he nevertheless feared that Maroons would flee to the mountains and turn the Old Dominion into another Jamaica. This dismal crisis might be averted by stopping the importation of Negroes, for Byrd now saw the source of Virginia's woes in the quote-unquote few ravenous traders, who would willingly sell their own wives and fathers, quote, if they could black their faces and get anything by them, end quote. A West Indian correspondent whose report of 30 slave executions appeared in London Magazine insisted that planters would really like to be rid of all their Negroes. England had forced an excess of slaves upon the helpless sugar growers. Jamaicans thought the villains were absentee proprietors who hired cruel overseers and who refused to balance their purchases of slaves by encouraging white immigration. According to Governor Edward Trelawney, the island's preservation depended on increasing the number of white settlers, and yet Britain opposed extra taxes on absentee owners who failed to provide one white inhabitant for every 30 slaves. Later in the century, Cuban slaveholders at once called for cheaper slaves and blamed the Asiento system for the problems arising from a growing Negro population. Hey, Super Nambro. Oh, you came in. It's only been 3 minutes. That's good. Um, how you doing tonight? Glad to see you come in. Thank you for stopping in, even if you're not listening. Um, I understand people lurk. I lurk all the time. Such a mixture of fears and rationalizations helps us to understand the motives behind the various taxes which colonies imposed on the importation of slaves. Because these duties were often disallowed in England, it was easy for Thomas Jefferson and later historians to picture the continental colonies as the innocent victims of British avarice. But the colonists' intentions seem more questionable when we note first that increased duties frequently followed periods of slave unrest and insurrection. Second, even when such taxes were not disallowed in England, they were easily evaded. Negroes destined for New York and Pennsylvania, for example, were often landed in New Jersey, where there were no duties for a period of nearly 50 years. Third, duties were imposed by such colonies as Jamaica, which no one could accuse of being hostile to slavery. Fourth, the restrictive measures were often associated with harsh, discriminatory laws against all Negroes. In Massachusetts, for instance, a restrictive duty of 4 pounds on every imported Negro was part of the 1705 law, quote, for the better preventing of a spurious and mixed issue, end quote, which was clearly designed to preserve the quote unquote purity of white servants and to encourage their immigration. That the law was not intended to injure the slave trade is seen in a provision offering a rebate of the whole duty on Negroes re-exported within a year. When British authorities finally gave in to Jamaica's demands for a duty, they suggested that the island's white population might be increased by excluding Negroes from all trades and crafts. The colony responded with a law prohibiting the employment of or hiring out of Negro tradesmen or artisans, but it was as unenforceable as a similar measure adopted in 1751 by South Carolina. Much earlier, the Pennsylvania Assembly had decided that such a law, though strongly desired by white workers, would be unjust to the owners and employers of slaves. We may conclude that the colonial demand for cheap labor was often restrained by a fear that excessive numbers of Negroes would inhibit white immigration and endanger public security. In such areas such as Virginia, an additional motive for restrictive duties can be found in the desire of large planters to increase the value of their slaves and to limit the production of tobacco at a time of surplus crops and low prices. A revenue measure which increased the price of all slaves was naturally preferred to direct poll taxes paid in commodities of declining value. And from Jamaica to Virginia, excuse me. From Jamaica to Virginia, many planters realized that heavy purchases of slaves simply added to colonial debts and hence to the precariousness of the economy. But despite examples of occasional moral protest, there is little evidence prior to the great conflict between Britain and her colonies that restrictive duties implied a hostility to slavery itself. It is true that in Pennsylvania many Germans and Quakers opposed the introduction of slaves on moral as well as economic grounds. But before 1730, Quaker merchants were actively engaged in importing Negroes from the West Indies, and sorry, much of the sluggishness of the market seems to have arisen from the fact that these were often refuse Negroes who proved of little value to their buyers. In as late as 1761, when Pennsylvania set the duty at 10 pounds, the law exempted new settlers who brought Negroes into the colony. Nor on the surface was Pennsylvania in advance of South Carolina, where an act of 1760 was apparently intended to bring a temporary halt to all importation of slaves. Yet by the 1760s and early 1770s, the motives of colonists were beginning to diverge. In Jamaica, as well as Massachusetts, legislators pressed for additional duties on Negroes. But while the Jamaicans had no thought of stopping the flow of Negroes from Africa, the northern colonists were beginning to see a fundamental contradiction between slavery and their sense of national purpose. Later on, we shall explore some of the cultural and intellectual sources of their divergence. We have quite a ways to go. Um, I am actually going to take a quick break, step away for just a few minutes because I need to get up and move around. I'm actually as I'm really enjoying this, but at the same time, I'm tired. It's been a long day and I'm getting droopy. So, um, so little. So I will be right back in just a couple minutes, and we will continue and finish up that chapter. All right, let's get back to it. So where was I? I believe I was right here. Later on, we shall explore some of the cultural and intellectual sources of this divergence. It is important to note, however, that even the conflict between fear and avarice brought occasional glimpses of the larger moral dilemma of slavery. In 1716, a tract written in Massachusetts on the question of banks and economic growth made the conventional charge that Negro slaves were an obstacle to white immigration, but that then went on to cite the proverb that the receiver is as bad as the thief, and to ask, quote, "Are not we of this country guilty of that violence, treachery, and bloodshed that is daily made use of to obtain them?" End quote. The author even suggested that the colony would benefit more from a law abolishing slavery over the next 20 years than from police regulations designed to protect the public security. Peter Fontaine, rector of Westover Parish in Virginia, also moved beyond the usual complaint that slavery discouraged the settlement of white merchants and artisans. Though he blamed the slave trade on England, he recognized that the purchase of slaves drew Virginians, quote, into the original sin and curse of the country, end quote. And yet, life in the colony would be impossible without slaves. Fontaine could conclude only that poverty was Virginia's best protection, since profits always led to increased demand for slaves. He must have known, however, that America had not been founded on ascetic ideals. One of the most curious expressions of mixed anxieties appeared in an anonymous, and this is the title, essay concerning slavery and the danger Jamaica is exposed to from the too great number of slaves, which was published sometime in the mid-18th century. The author was chiefly alarmed over repeated insurrections and the certainty of disaster if slaves were not more carefully managed. He appealed to Parliament to stop the importation of slaves in the interest of imperial security. He was as hostile toward Negroes as toward the rich planters who greedily yelped for greater supplies of cheap labor. It was because Negroes had been allowed to practice honorable trades that the white population had diminished. If the lazy household Negroes were turned out to the fields and replaced by free white men, the island would be much better off, and there would be no need for the African trade if masters could beat their barren Negro women once a year and offer small rewards to those who bore children. Despite such prejudices, the author presents an imaginary debate between a planter and an army officer who admits to being a madman, visionary, and enthusiast. The officer refutes certain philosophical justifications for slavery with the delight of a self-taught man, paying particular attention to the absurdity of Locke's theory of bondage as a continuation of war, and if the author himself accepts the necessity of Negro labor in tropical colonies, he is uneasily aware that, quote, whatever nation in America declares first for liberty and absolutely abolishes slavery must be masters of the whole continent, or as much of it as they please, end quote. Of all the French, British, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies in the New World, only Georgia, the refuge for debtors and orphans, attempted to avoid the stain of Negro slavery. A possible exception can be made for another refuge, Rhode Island, where the General Court at Warwick, meeting on May 19, 1652, ordered that no black mankind or white, quote unquote, were to serve longer than 10 years, quote, from the time of their comminge, C-O-M-I-N-G-E, comminge, within the liberties of their colony, end quote. But there is no evidence that this remarkable law, framed when the commissioners of Newport and Portsmouth were absent, was ever seriously enforced. If Georgia and Rhode Island were envisioned for a time as sanctuaries for the oppressed, the one became the original seat of the Cotton Kingdom and the other the capital of North America's trade in slaves. Most of the problems and conflicting desires raised by American slavery were concentrated explosively in a brief 14 years of Georgia's history. The promoters of the colony had been moved by that English blend of utilitarian shrewdness and concern for human suffering, which was ultimately based on a conviction that practical philanthropy furthered both profit and the best interest of the empire. By 1730, various benevolent groups in Britain had established traditions and lines of communication which enabled men of different backgrounds to cooperate in projects extending far beyond the limits of local charity. whether concerned with converting Indians and Negroes to Christianity or with the plight of imprisoned debtors and European refugees, these philanthropists could draw on the practical experience of missionaries, soldiers, and statesmen. Hard-headed and well-informed, they could not sympathize with the suffering debtor without also recognizing that when imprisoned he was utterly useless to the state. In the colonies south of the Savannah River, the unproductive classes might furnish Britain with silk and wine for which she depended on Catholic Europe. And they would also erect a buffer state between Carolina and Spanish Florida. Founded on the principles of strict mercantilism, such a colony could avoid the shortcomings of Jamaica, where unequal distribution kept land unproductive, and of New England, whose interests were often at odds with the mother country. Indeed, as a promotional tract suggested, Georgia would be absolutely dependent on England for supplies and credit, and would thus serve as the counterweight to other colonies which might tend toward independence. And as a stabilizing force and buffer zone, Georgia would obviously be more effective if she were free from the danger of slave revolt. It has been said that James Oglethorpe, who was deputy governor of the Royal African Company and who owned slaves on a Carolina plantation, was an abolitionist at heart. It is true that he said during the later controversy over admitting slaves to Georgia that a colony founded to bring relief to the distress of Europe should not be the cause of enslaving thousands of free Africans. And among the groups contributing knowledge and organization to the Georgia Project, there was a tradition of interest in educating and Christianizing Negro slaves. Yet slaves were not excluded from Georgia by the Charter of 1732, but by the special law of 1735, quote, for rendering the colony of Georgia more defensible, end quote. The most powerful argument beyond this prohibitive act, which was stoutly opposed by upholders of the slave trade, such as Earl of Dartmouth, was that Georgia would lose its strategic military value if the Spanish in St. Augustine could incite slaves to desert or revolt. Later, after he had failed to capture St. Augustine, Oglethorpe thought this view was dramatically confirmed by the success of the Spanish in fomenting slave insurrections in Carolina and New York, and a quote-unquote mutinous temper among the inhabitants of Savannah. He was certain it was the plot of the Spanish to undermine Georgia with slaves and liquor. In 1735, however, there were other weighty reasons for making Georgia the first non-slave-holding colony. As we have seen, the West Indies and South Carolina had been unsuccessful in their efforts to attract white settlers, and if the presence of Negroes should deter white immigration to Georgia, the colony would lose its very purpose. Moreover, the British market had been flooded with tropical produce, and it was undesirable that a new colony add to the surfeit. Experience had shown that slavery produced an idle class of wealthy but debt-ridden planters, who aroused the envy and hostility of those who could not afford to purchase Negroes. Such a society obviously conflicted with the vision of a frugal and gratefully dependent peasantry whose steady labor would furnish Britain with silk and wine. But we should not allow these practical considerations to obscure the central point. Slavery had not been excluded from the ideal societies of Plato and Thomas More, nor from the social experiments of Las Casas, the English Puritans, or William Penn. The founders of Georgia not only envisioned a state whose economic, social, and military purposes would be defeated by slavery, but they thought it impracticable to build such a state on the border of South Carolina. This is not to say that they sought to undermine the social systems of the older colony. One of the backers of Georgia praised the quote unquote excellent laws drafted by Locke and Shaftesbury, which had, of course, provided for slaves in Carolina. The Prohibition Act of 1735 allowed Carolinians to reclaim Negroes who escaped into Georgia. Other Negroes found in the colony were to be seized and sold, and the trustees were to receive the proceeds. But although these measures hardly suggest hostility to the principle of human bondage, the fact remains that in 1735 some Englishmen saw slavery as basically incompatible with one of the potentialities of America. If courts of law had not yet found the air of England too pure for slaves to breathe, the soil of Georgia would be free. Unfortunately, even by 1735, some of the inhabitants of Georgia had decided that the soil could never be productive unless tilled by slaves. The demand increased in succeeding years. Prominent citizens such as Robert Williams and Thomas Stevens felt that the colony would sink into ruin if not supplied with Negroes. The 18 illiterates who put their marks on a petition to the trustees in 1738 apparently thought that their lives would be happier if they could acquire slaves. But this rising clamor also brought dissent and thus provoked one of the first public controversies in America over the expediency and justice of Negro slavery. Later controversies would often center on the means of reforming or abolishing slave systems originating in the past. But in America, the great debate would begin and end with essentially the same momentous question: should individuals be allowed to bring slaves into areas which had not had slaves before? The sturdy Germans of Ebenezer did not want slavery because, as they said in a petition, Negroes would rob their houses and fruitful gardens. 18 Scots of Darien assured the trustees in 1739 that, contrary to the claims of an earlier petition from Savannah, slaves would endanger the colony's security, bring mounting debts, and burden the inhabitants with guard duty. But by now the examination of slavery's inconveniences had led to a new angle of vision, for the Highlanders reinforced their case by adding, quote, "It's shocking to human nature that any race of mankind and their posterity should be sentenced to perpetual slavery, nor in justice can we think otherwise of it than they are thrown amongst us to be our scourge one day or another for our sins, and as freedom to them must be as clear as to us, what a scene of horror must it bring about, and the longer it is executed, the bloody scene must be the greater." End quote. Various inhabitants of Darien later swore that this petition had been written by one of Oglethorpe's officers to lend support to the trustees' position, and that the signers had been bribed by promises of cattle and servants. The number of Georgians who opposed slavery was admittedly small, and in the last analysis it does not really matter how many of the 18 Scots believed in the sentiments of the above passage. There is no reason to doubt that the author's sincerity in writing two sentences that went far beyond the position of the trustees. By combining the ideal of natural rights with biblical guilt and catastrophism, he struck a chord that would reverberate through anti-slavery movements and culminate in Lincoln's second inaugural address. But the controversy in Georgia seldom rose above the level of expediency. George Whitefield was certain that neither the colony nor his beloved orphan house could succeed without the labor of Negro slaves. He acknowledged that the slave trade was conducted, quote, "in a wrong way," end quote. But since there was nothing he could do about that, he would be most fortunate, he said, if he could purchase a good number of Negroes and make their lives comfortable. If the great revivalists considered cruelty to slaves to be unchristian, he confessed in 1751 that he had no doubts on the lawfulness of slaveholding. Indeed, the providence of God had appointed certain climates, such as Georgia, for the labor of Negroes who could thus be brought under the paternal care of Christian masters. After criticizing the trustees for their ignorance of God's designs, Whitefield finally realized his ambition and acquired a plantation and some 75 slaves. Whew. We have still quite a ways to go. We're on 149. We have to get to 164. His views, however, were vigorously contested by the Reverend John Martin Belzius of Ebenezer, who was deeply shocked when he heard of Whitefield's pro-slavery petition. It would be better, Belzius said, to abandon the orphan house entirely than to use it as an excuse for Negro slaves. And if Whitefield was sincere in his longing to convert the heathen, which Belzius doubted, there was room for considerable effort in South Carolina. But although Belzius predicted that slavery would add to the sins of the land, his opposition was rooted in a conviction that Negroes would endanger the colony and corrupt or impoverish the whites. I'm going to stand up. So you're not all focused on my balls. I'm going to bring the camera up a bit too. So in Charlestown, he said white laborers were unable to compete with slaves. Forced to migrate to remote areas, they soon found their agricultural produce was undersold by that of slaveholders who were closer to markets and whose production costs were lower. In order to survive, the Carolinian yeoman was obliged to buy slaves on credit or seek employment as an overseer. And Belzius added, quote, I hear the Negroes in Carolina learn all sorts of trade, which takes away the bread of a poor white tradesman likewise, end quote. Still clinging to the original idea of a refuge for the industrious poor and the persecuted Protestants of Europe, the good minister insisted that Georgia summers were no hotter than those in parts of Germany, and that his diligent Salzburgers could help support the colony by producing hoops, staves, and shingles for the West Indian market. But even John Martin Belzius finally gave in and accepted Negro slavery as a necessity. By 1748, the utilitarian arguments for prohibition had lost their force. The colony's economic development had failed to meet original expectations. Little effort had been made to prevent Carolina planters from bringing slaves across the Savannah River or to stop the institution from creeping southward. Indeed, Savannah was receiving shipments of Negroes directly from Africa. On May 16, 1749, the trustees finally recognized the hopelessness of their stand. A petition from President William Stevens and his assistants admitted that the law of 1735 had not been enforced, and after noting that many Carolinians had applied for grants of land on the condition that they might be permitted to bring their slaves, the petitioners concluded that any further efforts to observe the law would depopulate the colony. Aware that continuing prohibition was opposed by the Board of Trade, by Horace Walpole, and by a growing number of Parliament, the trustees decided to ask for repeal. The new act, which received the royal assent in 1750, anticipated measures demanded some 70 years later by British reformers. There was to be a registry of all Negroes born, sold, or imported. Slaves were to be instructed in Christianity and protected from inhumane treatment. The original purposes of the colony were supposedly preserved by requiring slaveholders to maintain one white worker for every 4 Negroes and by forbidding racial intermarriage and the hiring out of slaves. But British authorities were no more able to regulate colonial slavery than to prohibit its spread. The New World might offer opportunities to the debtor or persecuted Protestant, but the experience of Georgia seemed to suggest that slavery and opportunity often advanced together. The Negro Trade, wrote Malachi Postlethwaite, and the natural consequences resulting from it may be justly esteemed an inexhaustible fund of wealth and naval power to this nation. End quote. This dictum of an eminent political economist scarcely needed demonstration in the mid-18th century when Britain's attention was focused on the Caribbean. Yet the economic value of colonial slavery had not always appeared so obvious. In 1624, for example, William Uselinx had advised the King of Sweden that his colonies would provide better markets and produce more for the mother country if they were settled with free Europeans. By 1668, however, Josiah Child, the mercantilist and future governor of the East India Company, could answer such views by observing that the immigration of white laborers only deprived the nation of workers and consumers. In the West Indies, on the other hand, a small number of Englishmen controlled an enormous force of Negroes whose labor stimulated trade with England and hence increased domestic wealth, employment, and population. Despite his changing opinions on the questions of monopoly and free trade, Charles Devenant remained unshaken in his conviction that of all branches of foreign commerce the slave trade was the one most naturally adapted to the interests of Britain and her colonies. For Postlethwaite, as for Devenant and other influential economists, the African trade had those characteristics of the divinely contrived system which so appealed to the 18th century mind. It not only provided Britain with a favorable balance of trade, but surplus Negroes could be sold to the Spanish in exchange for bullion. The African market stimulated both shipping and manufacture, and where the loss of the white laborers would weaken the British economy, an increase of slaves in the plantations simply added to total capital. Devenant took pains to answer the argument that monopolies were inconsistent with the natural rights and common liberties of mankind. He felt no need to consider the relevance of these ideals to slavery. It was a system, then, from which everyone benefited, and precisely because of its supreme value, the traffic was the testing point in the world struggle for empire. France had shown her wisdom in giving the slave trade a direct subsidy. In France, Jean-François Mellon, a pioneer economist who was highly praised by Voltaire, had gone even further in his defense of slavery. He conceded that to non-philosophical minds the institution might well appear as an evil, but just as the perfections of the universe justified evils that outraged men incapable of comprehending the whole, so the good of the nation justified apparent injustices. Making use of Locke's principle of association of ideas, Mellon showed how slavery had acquired a bad name. Because slavery originated in the violence of war, it had been associated with barbarism, but when considered as a social and economic institution, regulated by laws and conventions such as the Code Noir, it was clearly superior to free labor. It conformed indeed to the natural structure of the universe, which evidenced an infinity of graduations and subordinations, of which slavery was only a part. Since true principles were uniform in application, Milan acknowledged that even in Europe slavery would be preferable to a system which deprived the worker of economic and social security, but the prejudices of education would prevent Europeans from enslaving their neighbors, and to Milan, who considered mulattoes a dangerous deformity, the introduction of Negroes was out of the question. Perhaps no thinker so well demonstrated how the principles of the early Enlightenment could be applied to a defense of human bondage. One may assume that when profits from a slave trading voyage could run as high as 50%, it was relatively easy to associate the system with the beneficent order of the universe. The merchants of Havre, Nantes, St. Malo, and Bordeaux, who aspired to culture and who patronized the French Enlightenment, could not forget that the prosperity of these booming ports rested on sugar and slaves. This raises the question whether the colonial labor system would seem less in harmony with the laws of nature if its economic value appeared to diminish. It has been argued that Britain became disenchanted with the slave trade only when her own Caribbean colonies were on the decline and when it was very much in the interest of France to increase the labor force in Saint Domingue. Recent research has convincingly challenged this view, although economists still debate the long-term effects of slave labor on a society's balanced economic growth. In any event, we should greatly oversimplify the problem if we were to see too close a correlation between economic profit and social values, or to conclude that anti-slavery attitudes were a direct response to economic change. Since men tended to associate slavery with the functioning of a vast system of production and exchange, we need rather to ask what elements of strength or weakness in the system might affect the image of slavery held by an essentially non-slave holding society. In the 18th century, Europe was in search of foreign markets, and the African princes and traders showed considerable ingenuity in devising ways to maximize the inflow of European goods. A slaving captain was often obliged not only to pay anchorage fees and taxes to the king, but to hire interpreters, butlers, messengers, gong beaters, trunk keepers, and washerwomen at various points along a single coast or river. The special fees and required presents multiplied during long weeks of haggling and negotiation. Unfortunately, while African tribal power came ever more to depend on European goods, particularly on firearms, slaves were the only commodity greatly desired by Europeans. This incessant demand and competition, coupled with the evolution of a highly specialized system, led naturally to an increase in the price of slaves. European traders found it difficult to pass on these mounting prices to their American customers. Though they tended to move south and east in their search for more and cheaper Negroes, only the most prosperous American agriculture could continue to subsidize, as it were, the export of European goods to Africa. Nevertheless, from 1730 to 1775, the value of British exports to Africa increased by some 400%. Birmingham iron manufacturers, Liverpool gunmakers, refiners, cutlers, dyers, weavers, packers, coopers, fishers, shipwrights, rope makers, and sail makers felt that their interests were sufficiently identified with the slave trade to petition at various times in its favor. Before the American Revolution, approximately one-third of the British merchant fleet was engaged in transporting 50,000 Negroes a year to the New World. Closely linked with the high realms of insurance and banking, the trade rested on a wide base of speculative investment involving large and petty capitalists and the holders of annuities and mortgages. In the England of George II, with its latitudinarian temper of compromise and worldly wisdom, the slave trader was not only socially respectable, but his business was a recognized route to gentility, and was officially approved by the Board of Trade, the Navy, and the nobility. Many accumulated from the African trade or from West Indian plantations bought peerages and political power, and before the mid 18th century, the men whose income was derived from the slave system had become a formidable pressure group in British politics. The effects of a system which ramified throughout the British economy were felt scarcely less in North America. Apart from the exports of slave-grown rice, tobacco, and indigo, on which the economies of the southern colonies depended, and apart from the slave ships of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, the North American colonies sent to the West Indies a large proportion of their exports of fish, oats, corn, flour, and lumber, and virtually all of their exported peas, beans, hogs, and horses. This trade contributed greatly to the prosperity of New England and the Middle Colonies, and without it, the expansion of slave trade and West Indian plantations would hardly have been possible. It was indeed an illicit trade with North America that enabled the French colonies to expand production until by 1789 the exports of St. Domingue alone were more than one-third greater than those of the combined British West Indies. For their part, the Assembly of Rhode Island claimed in 1764 that the colony was utterly dependent on molasses from the French and Dutch colonies. When distilled into rum, it had furthered Britain's interests by replacing French brandy in the slave markets of Africa. But this system, which seemed of equal benefit to New England fisherman, to Pennsylvania farmer, to Jamaican planter, and to British manufacturer, and so to be in conformity with the delicately balanced laws of nature, involved awesome risks. Outfitting slave ships was expensive, and costs continued to climb throughout the 18th century. It was often difficult to produce a cargo of slaves without protracted delays on the African coast, which meant a waste of provisions, sickness, and mortality. Ship captains sometimes disregarded frightful lessons from the past and gambled on losing a large proportion of their cargoes by overcrowding. During the Middle Passage, the spread of dysentery, aggravated by outbreaks of smallpox and measles, occasionally raised slave mortality to 50% or more. Profits were also jeopardized when colonial planters delayed payment or refused to honor their debts, despite the allure of high returns on investment. Some prominent merchants, such as the Charand brothers of Nantes, concluded that the slave trade was a waste of time and money. The very existence of the slave trade depended, of course, on the prosperity of the West Indies, to those who had considered slavery in any society as a kind of economic cancer leading inevitably to the depletion of soil and capital. The British Leeward Islands, Barbados, and the Chesapeake colonies offered clear evidence of stagnation. While the profitability and relative efficiency of plantation agriculture is no longer in doubt, there is still considerable debate over the consequences of concentrating a major proportion of society's wealth in slaves. From the late 18th century onwards, observers from free labor regions were increasingly struck by the slave society's seeming indifference to improvements that would increase the value of land and enrich communal living, by the lack of interest in soil conservation, better transport, town building, schools, machinery, and entrepreneurial activity that would reduce dependency on one or two exportable staples. One may note that the symptoms of speculative agriculture and colonial economic dependency have not been confined to slave societies, but for our purposes the important point is that the British Caribbean colonies exemplified a form of social impoverishment and economic imbalance that presented the antithesis of new ideals of national progress. Richard Pears, in his Chronicle of the Piney Family, has revealed both the weaknesses and contributions of the West Indian economy. The sugar plantation was first of all the way to wealth for the self-made man. In a sense, the planter was the prototype for future speculators and industrialists. And like the industrialist, who had little desire to become a permanent resident of the mill town he had created, the successful planter lost no time in retreating to England, where he might adopt the life of a West Country squire. If he lived pretentiously, as he often did, he would contribute to the growing prejudice against nabobs, whose astonishing wealth had not been sanctioned by generations of noblesse oblige. Nevertheless, with time a family acquired the manners of polite society and came to look with considerable distaste on the boorish habits of the managerial society left behind in the colonies, where men cared only for money, duels, lawsuits, and cockfighting, and where children were hopelessly spoiled. Unfortunately, it was usually necessary to return temporarily to America if one's estates and thus one's income were not to be lost. Absenteeism has usually been cited as a principal cause of the decline of the West Indies, and yet the separation of ownership and management has come to characterize modern industry. No doubt, many of the attorneys, as they were called, who were left in charge of West Indian estates were either incompetent or were interested only in returning to England after squeezing sufficient income from a plantation. But the chief cause of difficulty would seem to have been that many plantation owners expected to live the serene life of country nobles, aloof from the cares of the speculative, capitalistic environment which gave them their wealth. Confident that the West Indian goose would continue to lay golden eggs, they gave little thought to the need for expanding markets, for technological innovation, or for overcoming wasteful practices. When profits declined as a result of slave trade abolition, falling prices, and mounting costs, they speculated in shipping, the sugar commission business, or West Indian mortgages. Finally, when plantations could scarcely pay interest charges on swollen debts, the successful proprietors, such as the Pineys, transferred their capital to industry and railroads. If the system provided an initial thrust for the economies of Europe and North America, the society it left behind was a burnt-out shell. The profits taken from tropical agriculture had gone either to Britain or for the purchase of additional slaves. Of schools, roads, and welfare institutions, the West Indies were virtually destitute. Unlike the American South, they even lacked a substantial population of poor and middle-class whites, Here, one might conclude, was the pure form of American speculative exploitation, unmitigated by the American ideal of creating a more perfect society. And yet, many boom areas, many mining and factory towns, have shared a similar fate. The visitor to Barbados or Guadeloupe would find it difficult to believe that they were once fountains of the wealth of nations. But the same would be true of dozens of forgotten, shabby towns in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and California. Overvalued at first, it was the misfortune of such areas to be finally abandoned as decayed wastelands, and if in the West Indies and American South the slave was not the prime cause of such misfortune, as has often been claimed, he was certainly its victim. The rise and fall of the American slave colonies in the 18th century was closely related to the international struggle for power. Can give only scant attention to this infinitely complex subject, hoping simply to identify the principal turning points and directions of change. We may confine our attention largely to Britain and France, since the Dutch Republic, which once had more than held her own against both countries, was seriously weakened by the War of the League of Augsburg and the War of the Spanish Succession. And on the African coast, the Dutch made the mistake of allying themselves with the enemies of the powerful Ashantis. In the great contest between Britain and France, each side possessed certain advantages. The British Caribbean islands enjoyed direct commerce with the continental colonies, and British ships took the lead in the slave trade. As we have seen, however, the French were able to exchange molasses for supplies from North America, and when the need arose, they nearly doubled the number of slaves in Saint Domingue in the space of a decade. British capitalists, attracted after 1713 by a great increase in the domestic demand for sugar, invested heavily in West Indian properties and thus stimulated a rapid expansion of sugar production and the slave trade. But this expansion soon revealed two weaknesses from which the British islands would never recover. Continuing investment led to a rising burden of debt and hence to heavy interest charges and higher costs of production. But from 1728 to 1739, expanded production brought a slump in sugar prices, which undermined planters operating on a narrow margin of profit. Given a protected and therefore limited domestic market, it was increasingly essential to sell surplus sugar in Europe. But here, the British planters and merchants faced another difficulty. Costs of production were lower in the French colonies, partly because French planters who often remained on the islands could not rely on investment from abroad and were accordingly obliged to draw on surplus for the purchase of lands and slaves. Unburdened by heavy debts, the French were able to undersell the British in continental markets, where sugar prices by mid-century were little more than half of those in England, and though some British planters grew rich from selling sugar at high prices in the home market, they recognized that such wealth depended on keeping supply somewhat short of demand. Despite frequent criticism from British consumers, Jamaican planters were not eager to increase the relatively small proportion of land under cultivation, and in the wars of Spain and France, it was Britain's policy to injure foreign competition without acquiring new territories which might glut the domestic market. Whew. In the 1750s, it was apparent to some observers that the system of slave trade and West Indian sugar was an inadequate weapon in the economic contest for world power. This was especially true as Anglo-French rivalry intensified in India and North America. Malachi Postlethwaite, whose views provided a significant index to changing conditions, was extremely pessimistic over the apparent failure of wow, I am struggling, sorry. The apparent failure of Britain's loose and undisciplined colonial regime. Still bitter over Parliament's abandonment of the Royal African Company, he attributed France's improving position in part to the initiative and wise policies of her government, which had provided the slave trade with both regulation and fiscal encouragement. The consequences were cheaper slaves, more land under cultivation, and lower sugar prices. But while the slave trade was the basis of French colonial power, it had fallen to a ruinous state at the hands of British quote unquote separate traders, and might collapse entirely unless put on a better foundation. Wow, I am really struggling here. Just got a few pages left, though. We're on 160 out of 164. Without giving specific reason, Postlethwaite now felt free to profess a personal dislike for the trade and a wish that it might be stopped. This glimmer of latent humanitarianism he quickly extinguished by affirming that, quote, "we shall take things as they are and reason from them in their present state, and not from that wherein we could hope them to be." End quote. He acknowledged that it would be absurd to think of giving up the slave trade as long as Negroes were needed to produce sugar that would compete with that of rival colonies. Nevertheless, Postlethwaite's principal interest had shifted from the triangular trade to a grandiose vision of developing markets for British goods in the interior of Africa. Thus, Thus far, Britain had enjoyed, quote, "the mere skimming of the coasting trade," end quote, and was ignorant of the vast natural resources of the continent. Confident that human nature was the same throughout the world, he suggested that Negroes could be brought to see the pro- propriety of decent clothing, to build substantial houses that would require good furniture, and in short to, quote, "live something in the European way," end quote, which would clearly be to the advantage of European traders and manufacturers. A similar vision of civilizing Africa would be popularized by William Pitt and effectively linked with the movement to abolish the slave trade, but Postlethwaite saw no necessary conflict between a continuing slave trade and a new inland commerce monopolized by the East India Company. The important point was the Britain's economic future did not lie in sugar and slaves, but in beating France to the interior of Africa. Postlethwaite's view that the Caribbean was more vital to France than to Britain was confirmed, rather ironically, by the 7 Years' War. England's decision to keep Canada and to restore Guadeloupe and Martinique to France showed that statesmen were becoming aware of the value of North American markets, and also that British planters were powerful enough to block the acquisition of territories which would flood England with tropical produce. When it is recalled that from 1763 to 1773, British imports from the tiny island of Grenada, uh, which was retained, were worth 8 times as much as those from Canada. One can appreciate the threat presented by so rich a colony as Guadeloupe. But this triumph of British West Indian interests served only to stimulate an intensive expansion in the French Caribbean, which soon left the British colonies far behind. And because this French expansion depended in part on an illicit trade with North America, it contributed, as we well know, to increasing strains within the British Empire. The relative importance of the slave system to France was reinforced by the American Revolution, which deprived England of colonies whose Negro population by 1790 would be around 65% greater than that of the entire British West Indies. By that date, Virginia alone had nearly 40,000 more slaves than Jamaica, though roughly 160,000 less than St. Domingue. The Revolution also brought famine and acute shortages of supplies in the British Caribbean, as well as widespread unemployment in Liverpool, where the slave ships were forced to rest at their moorings. The Liverpool trade would rapidly revive in the 1780s, but the islands would continue to suffer from the loss of direct commerce with North America. On the other hand, both St. Domingue and Cuba began to look to the United States as their chief supplier. In spite of these growing weaknesses, British interests in the Caribbean were superficially stimulated by the acquisition of Grenada, Tobago, St. Vincent, Dominica, and the Grenadines in the 7 Years' War, and St. Lucia, Berbice, Demerara, Essequibo, and Trinidad in the later years with France in the later wars with France, Spain, and Holland. From 1763 to the 1820s, these new colonies presented successive frontiers for development and thus tended to resuscitate a declining system. It was the demand for labor in the ceded islands that brought the British slave trade to its peak at the end of the 18th century. Excuse me. And yet, the speculative development of new territory only aggravated the endemic problems of debt and agricultural surplus. By 1790, George Hibbert estimated the West Indian debt as at least 20 million out of a total capital investment of 70 million pounds. In the face of national war debts and increasing investment in industry, this put a heavy strain on London financial resources. Bankruptcies multiplied in the 1780s as planters suffered from falling sugar prices, rising costs of production, and an unprecedented succession of hurricanes. These hardships had just begun to abate when the revolution in St. Domingue shut off Europe's leading supply of sugar. Almost there, on the home stretch. While this destruction of the most profitable Caribbean colony put slavery on the defensive throughout the Western Hemisphere, the initial effect was a world shortage of sugar, which stimulated expanded production in the British Islands and in Cuba and Brazil as well. The supply was further augmented when Caribbean planters introduced new and more productive canes. It was Britain's abolition of the slave trade in 1807 that had the most decisive, though belated, effect of raising production costs and placing the British Caribbean colonies at a competitive disadvantage with slave importing regions. And though conditions were to improve for a time after 1814, their slow descent from riches to poverty could of course be seen as the inevitable result of a sinful system, and yet the rising areas of sugar production, Cuba, Brazil, Louisiana, Mauritius, depended on Negro slaves for their labor. Along with the great revolutions and wars of the period from 1776 to 1815, the world witnessed a momentous shift in the equilibrium of the American slave system. Before 1776, it had been centered in Leeward and Windward Islands of Jamaica and St. Domingue, drawing into orbit, as it were, the rice and tobacco colonies of North America. Sustained by European capital and North American provisions, the systems had provided Europe with a wealth of tropical produce and had supported both shipping and the marketing of goods in Africa. The 1780s saw acute distress in the British West Indies and depression in the American South. The latter area would continue to suffer from a long period of low tobacco prices and difficult adjustments to new techniques of rice cultivation. But the revolution in Saint Domingue, which shattered French power in the Caribbean, also opened the way for the expansion of American slavery into Louisiana and ultimately Texas. Even by 1815, use of the new cotton gin had led to the extensive cultivation of cotton in the Georgia, Carolina, Piedmont, and on westward into Mississippi Territory. New links were being formed between an American slave system and the rising textile industries of Europe and New England. And at the same time, slave labor enabled Cuba and Brazil to supply the world with increasing quantities of sugar, coffee, and cotton. For nearly 300 years, American Negro slavery had generated images of easy wealth and social decay, of national power and explosive insurrection. By the early 19th century, one might associate the institution with the violent ruin of Saint Domingue, the debts and depleted soil of Barbados and Virginia, or one might see in the great plantations of Brazil and Mississippi the indispensable foundations of modern industry. And that is the end of this very long chapter. The last few pages were a bit on the rough side. I apologize. But that is what that is. But we are on to chapter 6 next time, which will be Thursday. The legitimacy of enslavement and the ideal of the Christian servant, moral doubts and realizations is the name of the next chapter. So we'll pick that up Thursday. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the reading. I am really enjoying it. It looks like we're roughly about a third of the way through the page. Here's my bookmark. About a third of the way through the book, although the last, 20, 30 pages is probably indexed. And who knows, is there a bibliography here? He's got tons of footnotes I'm not reading. Otherwise, we'd be back halfway through what where we are now. So, yeah. If you want to read the footnotes, pick up the book. He won't benefit from it because he died, but pick it up. It's still well worth reading and worth buying. So, anyway, I will see you all tomorrow night. Tomorrow is Wednesday, so we're on to the Star Wars short story tomorrow night. And probably some Oblivion gaming, but not tonight. I am wiped out. So I will see you tomorrow night. Oh, you know what? I am going to go ahead and raid Super Nambro since he was nice enough to come in and give us a review. So bear with me just a minute.